Hi everyone, my name is Zach Johnson, and for my presentation I will be talking about the exploitation of Africa's natural resources and Africa's workers. To start this conversation off, I will begin by talking about Africa's natural resources, and as the map on the right from Al Jazeera indicates, there are plenty of natural resources distributed across the African continent. Now, each of these resources are fairly valuable as far as the markets go, but the bulk of Africa's wealth, to put it that way, comes from the trade of precious metals, fossil fuels, and diamonds. And to be more specific, for precious metals, the materials being exchanged would be gold, platinum, and cobalt. And for fossil fuels, it would obviously be oil and natural gas. But when it comes to each of these natural resources, perhaps the most valuable is cobalt, given its use in creating many of today's gadgets and technologies. However, it is because of the values associated with these natural resources that leads to them being exploited, both domestically and internationally. On the domestic level, you have state and national corruption leading to these resources being exploited. Well, it's not the resources themselves that are the target of the exploitation, it is the money being made that gets exploited, because instead of taking these profits from exporting these goods and redirecting them to other programs that could help tackle some of the problems facing these different nations, they are instead spread to different government leaders or business leaders to make them richer instead of trying to enrich their local population. And as a result, makes the living conditions in Africa a lot worse and makes many of the problems, whether it be poverty, disease, or housing, or even solving many of the violence between different groups living in the area, a lot harder to solve. And as such, the GDPs of these different African nations are unable to really grow and develop at a faster rate. And because of this, it makes the economies of these different nations somewhat worse, because they're unable to really generate as much money as they should be able to based on their economic activity. However, on the international level, these resources are being exploited primarily through how the prices from the African sellers to the international sellers change. And the example I have at the bottom relates to the coffee exports from Ethiopia, where you'll have Ethiopian farmers selling coffee at about $4 per kilogram, which is a reasonably fair price. However, you'll have international corporations in other countries acquiring this coffee and then selling it at a much higher price. And in the case of the article, they can make up to about $200 for the same amount of coffee, as opposed to Ethiopian farmers who are making no more than $4. And as you can see, this is a very unfair practice, as it's exploiting the work of these Ethiopian farmers. Unfortunately, the exploitation does not end there. As to make matters worse, the inhabitants of Africa or within these different countries are often forced to work in these areas to acquire these resources. Now, it is important to note that the working conditions in these different areas, no matter what resource is being acquired, the working conditions are not good. They are horrible. They are the worst working conditions that one could possibly think of, and they are probably the worst working conditions on the face of the earth. But to further make matters worse are the workers who will have to work there. And these are not voluntary employees. These are often adults and children that are forced to work in these areas, despite how hazardous the work area is and despite how minimal safety procedures or safety equipment is often provided to them. And in many ways, this is the modern day equivalent of slavery. And perhaps the worst example of these exploitative practices occurs in the Cobalt Mines in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Central Africa, as many of the workers there are completely children, and they're working in these very dangerous conditions to acquire these resources to export primarily to the United States, where companies like Google, Microsoft, Apple, and other big tech companies are purchasing these cobalt exports to use to develop their new computers, their new devices, their new whatevers. And what's very disturbing is that there's evidence to show that some of these companies may even be aware of, to some capacity, of how the cobalt they are purchasing was acquired, but they have essentially done nothing about it because they're probably not going to want to spend more money to get cobalt from a place that is ethically sourced, because why spend hundreds more dollars per an amount of cobalt when you can buy it from Africa at a fraction of the cost? Now, with all this information in mind, something all of you are probably wondering is, how has this happened? How has this exploitation been allowed to occur, and why is it still continuing? And for one, this is no doubt mercantilism gone awry. And as many of you know from the lecture video, mercantilism is essentially the theory of realism being applied to international trade. And the one tenet of this theory that strongly applies to this situation is the emphasis on conflicting interests in economic exchanges, as you have the African entities that want to sell and export these natural resources, and you also have the countries and companies within the global north, primarily countries within the United Nations, that are engaging in these trades with these African businesses, and they are sacrificing their integrity by engaging in economic activity with countries and companies that are involved in human rights abuses. Moreover, you have corruption in Africa, which is playing a strong role in allowing these exploitative practices to continue. One, there is an inadequate use of profits which are not being funneled to the right avenues to solve many of Africa's problems. And two, many of these African nations do not have a strong enough legal or economic system to make sure that both children and adults are not being forced to work in these hazardous work conditions. Perhaps most importantly is that there are flaws within the international trade system that do not address or acknowledge this severe humanitarian problem, as many, both in Africa and across the world, have argued that while Africa does have its fair share of the blame in this exploitation problem, it is also partly the fault of the West, that they have not engaged in certain legal actions to ensure that their own companies and their own citizens do not engage in business with entities that are engaged in human rights abuses, and that in many ways they are also responsible for encouraging this behavior, as continuing business with these African countries and nations is only allowing these exploitative practices to continue. So the reason why this discussion on the exploitation in Africa matters is, for one, there are clear violations of human rights at play. Not only is forcing adults and children to work in the manner that they are in Africa a human rights issue, but so is having them work in the hazardous conditions that they are. Combined, this generates a significant humanitarian crisis, and when you factor this in with other issues of poverty, ethnic violence in some countries, and in some instances ongoing wars or other conflicts, it makes the problems of this issue become a lot more significant and a lot harder to deal with. Moreover, global corporations, especially those within Western countries or those in the global north, are complicit in these abuses of human rights. While they may not be the ones forcing these children and adults to work in these hazardous conditions, by continuing to do business with the entities that they are encouraging this behavior to continue. And on this note, without global action, these human rights abuses will continue. So it is important that people are aware of what's going on in Africa and what many of the well-known companies across the world are doing that allows this behavior to continue. In conclusion, the exploitation of Africa's population and natural resources poses a significant problem for international trade. This is not only because there are ethical questions about the pricing of these resources once they leave African borders, but also because of the significant human rights concerns that are raised about how these resources are obtained. However, we can help to put these issues in the national spotlight by either spreading awareness via social media, purchasing products that are ethically manufactured and are in no way sourced by companies involved in forced or child labor, and most importantly, we could advocate for legislation which aims to resolve the problem of companies doing business with other entities that are involved in human rights abuses. The Works Cited page will also be included in the description down below. Also in the description will be a link to an article where a child who worked in one of these cobalt mines describes what the working conditions were like. I highly recommend you read this article.